The warning klaxons echoed through the crystalline halls of the Galactic Council's main station, as Admiral Zethkar's 4 eyes fixed on the impossible readings displayed before him. His scaled hands trembled as he adjusted the holographic display, hoping the sensors had malfunctioned. They had not. "Sir, the energy signatures are confirmed," his aide whispered, her voice carrying the same terror that gripped every being on the station. "It's them. The humans have returned." Zethkar's throat sacs inflated with a deep, shuddering breath. 3,000 years. 3 millennia since the Council had made their most controversial decision in galactic history. The vote had been close, but the outcome was absolute. Complete planetary annihilation. Earth had been erased from existence, along with every human soul that called it home. The justification had seemed sound at the time. Humanity had been expanding too rapidly, their technology advancing at an alarming pace. Where other species took millions of years to develop faster than light travel, humans had achieved it in mere centuries. Their military tactics were unpredictable, their diplomatic approaches unconventional, and their adaptability was unlike anything the galaxy had ever witnessed. The Council's xenobiologists had presented compelling evidence that humanity posed an existential threat to galactic stability. Their recommendation was simple: eliminate the problem before it grew beyond control. The vote was cast, the fleet was assembled, and Earth's sun was collapsed into a black hole, taking the entire solar system with it. For 3,000 years, the galaxy had known peace. Wars were conducted with proper protocols, expansion followed established patterns, and technological advancement proceeded at the comfortable, predictable pace that had governed civilization for millions of years. The human problem had been solved, or so they believed. Captain Sarah Chen stood on the bridge of the UES Retribution, her weathered hands gripping the command rail as she watched the massive council station grow larger through the viewport. Behind her, the bridge crew worked with quiet efficiency, their faces masks of controlled fury. These were the descendants of the survivors, the ones who had been scattered across distant colonies when Earth died. "Ma'am, we're receiving surrender requests from 17 different council species," reported Lieutenant Morrison from the communications station. "The Veltar are offering tribute. The Zephyrians are requesting immediate asylum negotiations." Sarah's laugh was cold and humorless. 3,000 years they've had to consider the consequences of their actions. Now they want to negotiate? The journey back to the galactic core had taken generations of planning. The scattered human colonies had slowly, secretly, rebuilt their civilization in the dark spaces between stars. They had learned from species the Council had never encountered, acquired technologies that defied conventional understanding, and developed capabilities that would have justified every fear the Council had harbored about human potential. But they had also learned patience. Where the old humanity might have charged headlong into revenge, the new humans had spent centuries preparing. They studied every Council species, mapped every military installation, and infiltrated every major governmental structure. When they finally revealed themselves, it would be total and overwhelming. "Admiral Zethkar is requesting communication," Morrison announced. "Put him through," Sarah commanded, settling into her captain's chair with predatory grace. The holographic display materialized before her, showing the reptilian council admiral in all his scaled glory. His 4 eyes darted nervously, and the gill slits along his neck fluttered with barely controlled panic. "Captain Chen," he began, his voice carrying the artificial confidence of a career politician, "I am Admiral Zethkar of the Galactic Council Defense Force. Your return has caused quite a stir among our member species." "I'm sure it has," Sarah replied, her voice eerily calm. "Tell me, Admiral, do you know why I'm here?" Zethkar's throat sacs deflated slightly. The Council's actions 3 millennia ago were a product of different times, different fears. We've grown as a galactic community since then. Perhaps we can discuss. Discussion? Sarah's voice cut through his words like a blade. The time for discussion was before you murdered 12 billion human beings. The time for negotiation was before you erased our homeworld from existence. The time for mercy was before you scattered my ancestors across the void like refugees. The Admiral's composure cracked visibly. "Captain, please understand. The decision was made by beings who are long dead. Current council leadership had nothing to do with, but they benefited from it, didn't they?" Sarah stood, her presence somehow filling the holographic space between ships. 3,000 years of unchallenged expansion. 3,000 years of technological stagnation because the one species pushing boundaries was eliminated. 3,000 years of peace built on genocide. Behind Sarah, the bridge crew continued their work with mechanical precision, weapon systems charged, shields hummed with energy, and tactical displays showed the positioning of the human fleet that had emerged from dark space like a nightmare made manifest. Thousands of ships, each one incorporating 3 millennia of human innovation and an equal measure of human rage. "What do you want?" Zethkar asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah smiled. And in that expression was something that made the Admiral's blood run cold. It was not the smile of a conqueror or a warrior. It was the smile of someone who had spent lifetimes planning this moment. "Justice, Admiral. We want justice. And we're going to collect it one council world at a time." The holographic connection terminated, leaving Zethkar staring at empty space. Around him, his crew worked frantically to coordinate defenses that they all knew would prove inadequate. The humans had returned, and they had brought with them the accumulated fury of 3,000 years. In the depths of space, the human fleet began to move with purpose toward the first of many destinations. The galaxy was about to learn what happened when you tried to erase humanity from existence. The lesson would be written in fire and carved in the ruins of civilizations. The first target was Veltar Prime, the homeworld of the species that had cast the decisive vote for Earth's destruction. Captain Sarah Chen watched from the bridge of the UES Retribution as her fleet dropped out of hyperspace in perfect formation around the blue-green world below. The Veltar had been preparing for 3 days since the human fleet's appearance at the Council Station. Their orbital defenses were powered up, their military fleet assembled in protective formation, and their planetary shields activated at maximum strength. It was an impressive display of galactic military doctrine, executed with the precision that came from millions of years of conventional warfare. It was also completely useless against what humanity had become. "Ma'am, the Veltar are hailing us," Lieutenant Morrison reported. "They're requesting terms for surrender." Denied," Sarah replied without hesitation. "Begin the demonstration." Commander Torres stepped forward from the tactical station. "Captain, the Retribution's singularity cannon is charged and ready. Target locked on their primary defense platform." Sarah nodded. The singularity cannon was humanity's answer to 3 millennia of rage and innovation. Where other species built bigger guns, humans had learned to weaponize the fundamental forces of the universe itself. The cannon created a controlled micro-black hole that consumed everything in its path before safely dissipating. Fire. The weapon discharged with no visible beam, no dramatic light show, no thunderous sound. One moment the Veltar's massive defense platform existed, bristling with weapons and shields. The next moment, there was simply empty space where it had been. Not destroyed, not damaged, gone, as if it had never existed at all. The effect on the Veltar fleet was immediate and devastating. Ships began breaking formation, their commanders suddenly understanding that everything they knew about warfare had become obsolete. Panic spread through their communications channels as they realized their strongest defensive position had been erased without effort. "This is Premier Qualseth of the Veltar Republic," a voice crackled over the communications array. The image that appeared showed a tall, elegant being with silver skin and large, dark eyes that now held unmistakable terror. "Please. We surrender unconditionally. We yield to human authority." Sarah studied the Premier's face with cold calculation. "Premier, your species voted for the extinction of mine. You celebrated when Earth burned. You built monuments to commemorate humanity's destruction. That was ancient history," Qualseth protested, his composure cracking. "Those decisions were made by ancestors we barely remember. Current Veltar leadership had nothing to do with. But you kept the monuments, didn't you?" Sarah interrupted. You taught your children that humanity was a threat that had to be eliminated. You used our extinction as justification for your expansion into what you called dead human space. The Premier's silence was answer enough. On the bridge of the Retribution, Dr. Elena Vasquez stepped forward. She was the fleet's xenoarchaeologist, one of the few humans who had spent decades studying the galaxy's response to humanity's extinction. Her research had guided the fleet's target selection. "Captain," she said quietly, "our intelligence confirms that Veltar children are still taught about the Great Cleansing as a necessary act of galactic hygiene. Their museums display artifacts taken from human colony worlds. They've turned our suffering into their cultural heritage." Sarah's jaw tightened. "Premier Qual Seth, you have 1 hour to begin dismantling every monument, every museum display, and every educational program that celebrates humanity's destruction. You will publicly broadcast an apology to be transmitted to every world in Council space. And if we comply?" the Premier asked desperately. "Then your world remains intact," Sarah replied. "But your species' role as a Council power ends today. You'll surrender your military fleet, your advanced technology, and your voting rights. You'll become a protectorate under human oversight." The Premier's silver skin paled to an almost transparent hue. "You're asking us to abandon everything we've built. Our civilization, our achievements. Everything you built was constructed on the foundation of our genocide." Sarah cut him off. "Consider this mercy. You still get to exist." The transmission ended, leaving the bridge in tense silence. Through the viewport, the human fleet maintained perfect formation around Veltar Prime, thousands of ships representing humanity's return to galactic prominence. Commander Torres approached Sarah's chair. "Ma'am, Admiral Petrov is requesting permission to begin Phase 2 operations." Phase 2 involved a more subtle but equally devastating attack. While the Veltar government scrambled to comply with human demands, human infiltration teams were already moving through Council space. These weren't traditional military units, but something far more dangerous. Humans who had spent generations learning to blend into galactic society. They had been watching, waiting, and preparing for centuries. Some worked as servants in Council government buildings. Others had built careers as traders, scientists, or entertainers. All of them had been activated when the human fleet arrived, and their mission was simple: reveal the true scope of the Council's crimes. Admiral Dmitry Petrov commanded this shadow war from his ship, the UES Reckoning. His agents were systematically accessing classified Council archives, uncovering evidence of atrocities that went far beyond Earth's destruction. The Council hadn't just eliminated humanity. They had systematically suppressed dozens of species that showed similar potential. "Captain Chen," Admiral Petrov's voice came through the secure channel. "Our archives teams have made significant discoveries. The Council's pattern of preventive extinction extends back 50,000 years. Humanity wasn't their first target, just their most recent." Sarah felt a cold satisfaction at the news. "How many species?" 43 confirmed genocides, hundreds of forced technological suppressions. The Council has been maintaining galactic stagnation for millennia by eliminating any species that advanced too quickly. This revelation would change everything. Humanity's return wasn't just about revenge for their own suffering. It was about liberating an entire galaxy from a system designed to prevent progress and growth. On Veltar Prime, the monuments were falling. Giant statues commemorating the Great Cleansing toppled as massive crowds watched in stunned silence. Museums emptied their displays of human artifacts while broadcasters struggled to explain the new reality to their viewers. But Sarah knew this was only the beginning. The Veltar were the smallest of the Council powers, chosen as an example rather than a true military target. The real test would come when humanity confronted the Council's core species, the ancient Zephyrians, the militaristic Keth Moran, and the enigmatic Void Singers who controlled galactic communications. Each represented a different aspect of the system that had destroyed Earth, and each would require a different approach to defeat. The Zephyrians commanded through economic power, the Keth Moran through military might, and the Void Singers through information control. Humanity would have to prove they could overcome all three if they wanted to reshape galactic civilization. Set course for Keth space, Sarah commanded. It's time to show the galaxy's greatest warriors what 3,000 years of human military evolution looks like. The fleet began to move, leaving Veltar Prime behind as the first monument to humanity's return. But Sarah knew the real war was just beginning. The Keth war fleet assembled at the edge of their home system was the largest military force the galaxy had seen in 10,000 years, 2 million warships arranged in perfect battle formations, their hulls gleaming with the dark metal that had made the Keth the undisputed military power of the Council. General Thakvor stood on the bridge of the dreadnought Eternal Conquest, his forearms crossed as he studied the tactical displays. The Keth had built their entire civilization around warfare, and their military doctrine was considered flawless by every galactic strategist. They had never lost a major engagement. Human fleet detected, his tactical officer reported. 15,000 ships approaching at standard velocity. Alder Merber. 71. Alder Merber, Thakvor's mandibles clicked with satisfaction. The humans might have surprised the Veltar with their strange weapons, but the Keth were prepared. His fleet outnumbered the humans by more than 100 to 1, and his ships were larger, better armed, and protected by shields that had withstood every weapon the galaxy could produce. Maintain defensive formation, he commanded. Let them come to us. Aboard the UES Retribution, Captain Sarah Chen watched the massive enemy fleet with calculating eyes. The Keth represented everything wrong with Council military thinking. Overwhelming force, rigid tactics, and an absolute belief in their own superiority. Admiral Chen, came the voice of Dr. Vasquez from her research station. The xenoarchaeologist had been promoted to admiral after her intelligence work proved invaluable in the Veltar campaign. Our historical analysis confirms that the Keth provided the fleet that actually destroyed Earth. General Thakvor's grandfather commanded the operation. Sarah's expression hardened. Then this is personal for both sides. The human fleet continued its approach, but something was wrong with their formation. Instead of arranging themselves for battle, they seemed to be spreading out randomly, their ships moving in patterns that defied military logic. Sir, the Keth tactical officer said hesitantly, the human ships appear to be scattering. Their formation makes no sense. General Thakvor studied the display with growing confusion. 3,000 years ago, human military tactics had been unpredictable, but not random. This looked like the behavior of a defeated force trying to flee. But the humans were still advancing. Perhaps they realized they cannot win, he mused. Prepare to accept their surrender. That was when the stars began to go out. The first sign was subtle. A slight dimming of the system's primary star. Then, one by one, the background stars visible through the viewport started to fade. Within minutes, the entire Keth fleet found itself surrounded by absolute darkness. What's happening to our sensors? Thakvor demanded. Unknown, sir. We're detecting massive gravitational distortions, but the source is unclear. It's as if space itself is being manipulated. The truth was far more terrifying. The human ships hadn't scattered randomly. They had positioned themselves to deploy humanity's most devastating weapon, the Reality Anchor Network. 3 millennia of studying dark energy and quantum mechanics had led to a technology that could temporarily isolate a region of space from the rest of the universe. The Keth fleet now existed in a pocket dimension where the normal laws of physics could be selectively suspended. Their shields, which relied on conventional energy dynamics, began to fluctuate. Their weapons, designed to work within standard spacetime, became unreliable. Sir, the communications officer called out in panic. We've lost contact with all forces outside this system. It's as if the rest of the universe has stopped existing. General Thakvor felt the first stirring of genuine fear. Impossible. No technology can isolate an entire star system. Sarah Chen's voice cut through the darkness, transmitted on all frequencies. General Thakvor, this is Admiral Sarah Chen, of the Human Liberation Fleet. Your grandfather burned my homeworld and massacred my people. Today, you face justice. Human, Thakvor replied, forcing strength into his voice. Your tricks cannot overcome superior numbers. We still outnumber you by— Numbers mean nothing when you can't use them effectively, Sarah interrupted. Observe. The human ships began to phase in and out of visible space, appearing to teleport between positions. But this wasn't teleportation. It was something far more advanced. The humans had learned to manipulate the quantum nature of matter itself, allowing their ships to exist in multiple positions simultaneously until they chose to collapse the probability wave. The Kethmoran fleet opened fire, their weapons creating a spectacular light show in the darkness. But their targets seemed to be everywhere and nowhere, their shots passing through space where human ships had been moments before. Then, the counterattack began. Human weapons didn't destroy Kethmoran ships, they unmade them. Quantum disruptors tore apart the atomic bonds that held matter together, causing entire dreadnoughts to simply cease to exist at the molecular level. Reality shapers rewrote local physics, turning the enemy's own weapons against them, or causing their ships to phase out of normal space entirely. Sir, we've lost 200,000 ships in the last 5 minutes. The tactical officer reported, his voice breaking with disbelief. Thakvor stared at the tactical display in horror. His perfect formations were dissolving, as ships vanished from existence, without warning. The greatest military force in galactic history was being systematically dismantled by an enemy they couldn't effectively target. All ships, Emergency Dispersal Pattern 7, he commanded. Activate quantum scramblers. Deploy reality anchors. Sir, his aide said quietly, we don't have reality anchors. That technology doesn't exist. The general's blood ran cold. Then what are the humans using? We're analyzing their technology now, the science officer called out. Sir, their ships appear to be operating using principles that were purely theoretical when they disappeared. They've had 3,000 years to develop technologies we can't even comprehend. Admiral Chen's voice returned, now speaking directly to General Thakvor. General, you have one chance to avoid complete annihilation. Surrender your fleet and prepare to stand trial for crimes against sapient life. Thakvor's mandibles clicked rapidly as he considered his options. The pride of his species demanded that he fight to the last ship, but the practical reality was becoming unavoidable. His fleet was being destroyed by weapons he couldn't understand, deployed by tactics he couldn't counter. What are your terms? He asked, the words tasting like poison. Complete surrender of all Kethmoran military forces. Full reparations for damages caused during Earth's destruction. Dismantlement of your military-industrial complex, and your personal testimony about the Council's decision-making process 3 millennia ago. The general closed his eyes. And if I refuse? Then your species joins humanity in extinction. The choice is yours. Around the fleet, human ships continued their deadly work. Each passing moment saw more Kethmoran vessels vanishing into quantum dissolution. The greatest military force in the galaxy was being defeated not by superior numbers or conventional tactics, but by the application of science so advanced it might as well have been magic. I surrender, Thakvor said finally. Kethmoran fleet stands down. The attacks ceased immediately. The stars began to return as the reality anchor network powered down, and normal space-time reasserted itself. But the lesson was clear. Humanity had evolved far beyond anything the Council could have imagined. Sarah Chen stood on her bridge, looking out at the remnants of the once mighty Kethmoran fleet. 2/3 of their ships had been eliminated, and those remaining were completely demoralized. Admiral Petrov, she said into her communicator, begin Phase 3 operations. It's time to visit the Zephyrian trade worlds. As the human fleet prepared to move to their next target, a message was transmitted across the galaxy. Species that had once celebrated humanity's extinction now watched in fear as the news spread. The humans had returned. They were unstoppable. And they remembered everything. The galaxy would never be the same. 3 millennia after the Council had tried to erase humanity from existence, the children of Earth were writing a new chapter in galactic history. And this time, they would be the ones deciding who had the right to exist among the stars. The age of human dominance had begun, built on the foundation of justice long delayed but finally delivered. 2 years had passed since the hegemony's ultimatum, and the Sol system had transformed into something unprecedented in galactic history. Captain Kiratel stood aboard the command deck of the newly commissioned vessel Times New Horizon Asterisk, watching as construction crews put the finishing touches on the massive orbital shipyards around Jupiter. The irony wasn't lost on her. The same species the galaxy had deemed primitive was now building the most advanced multi-species fleet in known space. "Final count is in," reported Commander Sarah Kim, Admiral Chen's former aide who now served as Director of Refugee Integration. "We're hosting representatives from 47 different species across 12 star systems. The Mars colonies alone house over 2 million beings." The transformation had been extraordinary. What began as a simple refugee crisis had evolved into a galactic movement. Word of humanity's sanctuary had spread through underground networks, traveling along trade routes, and carried by escaped slaves. Species after species had arrived seeking not just safety, but the chance to be part of something new. But the refugees weren't just passive recipients of human generosity. Each group brought knowledge, technology, and capabilities that exponentially increased the alliance's strength. The Aquatic Confederacy's biotechnology had revolutionized medicine and agriculture. The builders' architectural knowledge allowed for construction in environments previously thought impossible. The empathic collective's understanding of consciousness had led to breakthroughs in communication and coordination that made multi-species cooperation seamless. Most remarkably, the humans had refused to position themselves as leaders of this growing alliance. Instead, they served as facilitators and coordinators, helping different species find ways to work together. The result was a civilization that operated on principles of voluntary cooperation rather than hierarchical control. "Kira," Dr. Nemkol's voice came through her communicator, interrupting her thoughts. "You need to see this immediately." She found him in the intelligence center, surrounded by holographic displays showing communication intercepts from across the galaxy. His expression was grim but determined. "The situation is accelerating," he explained, manipulating the displays to show a galaxy-wide map. Red markers indicate recent hegemony pacification campaigns. In the past 6 months alone, they've eliminated 14 species and enslaved 7 others. But look at this. The map shifted to show green markers scattered throughout hegemony space. These are verified resistance cells. Over 300 active groups, spread across 87 star systems. They're all asking the same question: when will Earth intervene? Kiratel studied the data with growing concern. The hegemony is forcing the issue. They know that passive resistance will eventually spread to their own member species. They're trying to eliminate all opposition before it reaches critical mass. "There's more," Nemkol continued, bringing up communication logs. "We've been contacted by representatives from within the hegemony itself. 3 of their member species are requesting secret meetings to discuss potential defection." The implications were staggering. For the first time in galactic history, the hegemony's iron grip on civilization was showing cracks. But Kiratel knew this progress came with enormous risks. A desperate hegemony was more dangerous than a confident one. Admiral Chen arrived in the intelligence center looking exhausted but alert. The past 2 years had aged her considerably, but her resolve remained unshakable. "Captain, I assume you've seen the latest intelligence reports?" "Yes, Admiral. The question is what we do about it." "That's exactly what I want to discuss," Chen replied, activating a secure conference link. The holographic projector came to life, showing representatives from each of the major refugee communities and several human officials. "Ladies, gentlemen, and honored beings of all classifications," Admiral Chen began, "we're at a crossroads. The hegemony has accelerated their extinction campaigns, and resistance movements across the galaxy are looking to us for leadership. We need to decide whether Earth and our allies are ready to move from passive sanctuary to active resistance." Karis 9, the builder representative, chimed his response first. "Our people have run calculations on construction capabilities. Given current resource allocation and manufacturing rates, we can produce a fleet capable of challenging hegemony supremacy within 18 months. Military capability is only one factor," interjected Nalvera, speaking for the empathic collective. "The psychological readiness of our various populations must be considered." Some refugees still bear trauma from their previous encounters with hegemony forces. Maria Santos, now 15 and serving as a youth ambassador, raised her hand. With respect, the trauma isn't going to heal while the hegemony continues murdering innocent people. Every day we wait is another day someone's family gets destroyed. Oler, her blunt assessment cut through the careful diplomatic language. Kiratel had noticed this tendency in humans, their ability to reduce complex issues to essential moral choices. It was both refreshing and occasionally uncomfortable. Commander Vash Kal of the Zephyrian military spoke up. Our people vote for action. We've been running from the hegemony for 4 years. We're tired of hiding while others suffer as we did. The debate continued for hours, but gradually a consensus emerged. The Alliance had the technology, resources, and motivation to challenge hegemony dominance. More importantly, they had something the hegemony lacked: genuine cooperation between species with fundamentally different strengths and perspectives. The decision was formalized 3 days later in what became known as the Soul Accords. 47 species pledged to work together to end hegemony, oppression, and establish a new galactic order based on voluntary cooperation rather than forced submission. But the accords went beyond military alliance. They established principles for how civilized beings should interact, emphasizing diversity, individual choice, and mutual aid. Admiral Chen was elected as the Alliance's first coordinator, but with limited authority and a mandate to facilitate rather than command. Each species retained complete autonomy within their own communities, while contributing to collective defense and mutual aid efforts. The first test of this new alliance came sooner than expected. A massive hegemony fleet, over 200 vessels strong, arrived at the edge of Sol System under the command of Supreme Admiral Carthul, the hegemony's most experienced military leader. People of Earth. His transmission was broadcast across all frequencies. You have violated every principle of galactic order. Your contamination spreads across civilized space like a plague, turning stable populations against legitimate authority. This ends now. The ultimatum was simple. Surrender all refugees and submit to hegemony oversight, or face total annihilation. Earth and its allies had 24 hours to decide. The response came not from Admiral Chen or any single leader, but from the Alliance as a whole. Representatives from all 47 species appeared on screens across the hegemony fleet simultaneously, speaking in unison. Supreme Admiral Carthul, we are no longer refugees begging for sanctuary. We are free beings choosing our own destiny. Your authority ends where our liberty begins. The battle that followed would be remembered as the turning point of galactic history. The hegemony fleet was larger and more technologically advanced, but they faced something they had never encountered before. True coordination between species with radically different capabilities. Aquatic Confederacy vessels used bioorganic weapons that disrupted enemy sensors. Builder ships deployed crystalline projectiles that grew on impact, consuming enemy hulls from within. Empathic collective pilots coordinated alliance movements with telepathic precision that made traditional communication systems obsolete. Zephyrian fighters used their environmental tolerance to operate in conditions that would kill other species. And at the center of it all, human vessels served as coordinators and force multipliers, their crews working seamlessly with alien partners to maximize every advantage. But the true shock came when 12 hegemony vessels suddenly changed targets, turning their weapons on their own fleet. The secret defectors had chosen this moment to reveal themselves, throwing centuries of conditioning aside to join the Alliance. Supreme Admiral Carthul's final transmission was brief. This is not over. The hegemony will not fall to chaos. His fleet retreated in disorder, leaving behind 37 destroyed vessels and the shattered remnants of their reputation for invincibility. For the first time in galactic history, the hegemony had suffered a decisive defeat, but the Alliance leadership knew this victory was only the beginning. Across the galaxy, resistance movements were rising. Oppressed populations were demanding freedom. The rigid order that had maintained galactic civilization for millennia was crumbling. Standing on the bridge of the times, New Horizon times, as hegemony ships fled into hyperspace, Kiratel felt a mixture of triumph and apprehension. They had proven that the hegemony could be defeated, but that only meant the real war was about to begin. The galaxy had rejected her people and countless others, branding them as aberrants and criminals. But humanity had shown that there was another way, a path where diversity strengthened rather than threatened civilization, where cooperation achieved more than domination ever could. Now, they would discover whether the rest of the galaxy was ready to embrace that vision, or if they would have to fight for every species' right to choose their own destiny. Either way, there was no turning back. The age of hegemony dominance was ending, and something new was being born among the stars. The refugees had found more than sanctuary on Earth. They had found the foundation for a new kind of galactic civilization, built on the radical idea that freedom was worth fighting for, regardless of the cost. Number, rejected by the galaxy, but humanity opened its arms. The war had been raging for 3 years when Captain Kiratel received the message that would change everything. She stood in the command center of the Alliance flagship Times Unified Dawn *, watching holographic displays that showed the current state of galactic conflict. Green markers indicated liberated systems, red showed continued hegemony control, and yellow represented contested territories. The map was a chaotic patchwork of colors, reflecting a galaxy in revolutionary upheaval. "Ma'am," called Lieutenant Zara Lin, now serving as the Alliance's chief communication officer. "We're receiving a priority transmission from the hegemony core worlds. It's unusual." The main display shifted to show a figure Kiratel recognized but had never expected to see in this context. Counselor Tef Mal, of the Altarian Federation. One of the hegemony's founding species, but instead of the confident authority she remembered from their previous encounters, the Altarian looked exhausted and desperate. "People of the Alliance," Tef Mal began, her crystalline features showing stress fractures that indicated severe emotional distress among her silicon-based species. "I speak not as a representative of the hegemony, but as a being who has witnessed the madness consuming our leadership. I request immediate emergency sanctuary for my people." The message continued with revelations that shook the Alliance leadership to its core. The hegemony's inner circle had decided that if they couldn't maintain control through traditional means, they would implement the Final Protocol, a plan to systematically destroy any species that refused to submit, including their own member races if necessary. "They have begun construction of planet-killer weapons," Tef Mal revealed. "Not just to threaten resistance movements, but to actually sterilize entire worlds. The Supreme Council has declared that a galaxy with 1 trillion obedient beings is preferable to one with 1 quadrillion free ones." Dr. Nemkal, now serving as the Alliance's senior strategist, pulled up intelligence files that corroborated the Altarians' claims. "We've detected massive energy signatures at hegemony industrial centers. Whatever they're building requires more power than any conventional weapon system." Admiral Chen joined the emergency session looking grim. The past 3 years of warfare had taken their toll on her, but her determination remained unshakable. "If these reports are accurate, we're not just fighting for liberation anymore. We're fighting to prevent galactic genocide." The Alliance had grown enormously since the first victory at Sol. Over 300 species had joined the coalition, including nearly half of the hegemony's former member races. Liberated worlds contributed resources, technology, and populations to the cause. But the hegemony's remaining core worlds still controlled the galaxy's most advanced industrial infrastructure. "The question," said Karis 9, his crystalline body resonating with harmonic stress patterns, "is whether we can reach their construction facilities before they complete these weapons." Maria Santos, now serving as a full ambassador at age 18, studied the tactical displays with the kind of intuitive understanding that had made her invaluable to multi-species coordination efforts. "What if we're approaching this wrong? We keep thinking in terms of military solutions, but this is really a psychological problem." Her observation sparked intense discussion among the Alliance leadership. The hegemony's power had always rested on the belief that resistance was hopeless, that their technological and numerical superiority made opposition suicidal. But 3 years of successful rebellion had shattered that myth. "She's right," Admiral Chen realized. "The Final Protocol isn't a sign of strength, it's an admission of defeat. They're so desperate to maintain control that they're willing to destroy everything they claim to protect." Kiratel felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. We've been so focused on military victories that we haven't fully grasped the psychological impact of our success. Every world we liberate, every species that defects, proves that the hegemony's rule isn't inevitable. The Alliance's response to the final protocol was unlike anything seen in galactic history. Instead of massing fleets for a direct assault on hegemony strongholds, they launched the largest communication campaign ever attempted. Using captured hegemony broadcast networks, refugee testimonials, and defector revelations, they began transmitting the truth about the final protocol to every world in hegemony space. The broadcasts were simple but devastating. Beings across the galaxy learned that their own government was prepared to murder them rather than lose control. They saw footage of liberated worlds where former enemies worked together as equals. They heard testimonies from defectors who described the fear and paranoia consuming hegemony leadership. Most importantly, they saw proof that resistance was possible. The Alliance didn't hide their losses or pretend the fight was easy. But they demonstrated that even the hegemony's overwhelming technological advantages could be overcome through cooperation and determination. The effect was electric. Resistance movements that had been cautiously supporting the Alliance suddenly exploded into open rebellion. Hegemony military units began defecting en masse. Industrial workers sabotaged planet-killer construction projects. Even on the core worlds, protests and riots erupted as populations realized their rulers valued control over their lives. But the hegemony's desperation made them more dangerous than ever. Unable to maintain order through traditional means, they began implementing increasingly extreme measures. Entire populations were relocated to secure facilities. Suspected dissidents were executed without trial. Planets that showed signs of rebellion faced orbital bombardment. The crisis reached its peak when intelligence sources revealed that the hegemony had successfully completed 3 planet-killer weapons and was preparing to demonstrate their power by destroying Earth and 2 major alliance strongholds. "We have perhaps 72 hours before they're in position to fire," reported Commander Vash Cole during an emergency war council. "Even if we could reach their positions in time, these weapons are protected by the largest fleet concentrations in hegemony space." The room fell silent as the magnitude of the threat sank in. 3 years of successful resistance had led to this moment, the possibility that the hegemony would choose to destroy everything rather than accept defeat. It was Maria Santos who broke the silence with an observation that changed everything. "Why are we assuming they actually want to use these weapons? Think about it. If they destroy Earth and our main bases, they also destroy proof that alternatives to their rule are possible. But more than that, they make themselves the monsters they've always claimed we were." Her insight sparked a flurry of discussion. The planet killers weren't just weapons, they were the hegemony's final gamble to terrorize the galaxy back into submission. But that meant they were also vulnerable to psychological warfare. The Alliance's response was audacious in its simplicity. Instead of trying to destroy the planet-killer fleet, they surrounded it with every available vessel not to attack, but to bear witness. Hundreds of ships from dozens of species positioned themselves between the hegemony weapons and their targets, broadcasting continuously to every corner of the galaxy. "People of the galaxy," Admiral Chen's voice carried across every communication channel. "You are about to witness the true nature of those who claim to rule you. They would rather destroy worlds than lose power. They would murder billions rather than admit they were wrong." The psychological pressure on the hegemony fleet was enormous. Their crews knew that firing would make them the greatest mass murderers in galactic history. While the entire galaxy watched, ship after ship began standing down, refusing orders to target civilian populations. Supreme Admiral Carthul, commanding the lead planet killer, found himself increasingly isolated as his own fleet abandoned their positions. His final transmission was a mixture of rage and disbelief. "You have doomed the galaxy to chaos. Without order, without control, civilization will collapse into primitive barbarism." Admiral Chen's response was broadcast to every being in the galaxy. "Maybe. But we'd rather take that risk than accept the certainty of tyranny." The standoff lasted 18 hours. When it ended, 2/3 of the hegemony fleet had defected to the Alliance, and the planet-killer weapons were under new management. Supreme Admiral Carthul and the remaining hardliners retreated to a handful of fortress worlds, still convinced that their vision of galactic order was the only alternative to chaos. But across the galaxy, something unprecedented was happening. Species that had been enemies for millennia were working together. Worlds that had been isolated for generations were sharing technology and culture. The rigid hierarchies that had defined galactic civilization for thousands of years were being replaced by networks of voluntary cooperation. It wasn't perfect. There were conflicts over resources, misunderstandings between species with radically different biologies and cultures, and the constant challenge of coordinating efforts across thousands of light years. But for the first time in galactic history, these problems were being solved through negotiation rather than conquest. Standing on the bridge of the time's unified dawn times as former hegemony worlds celebrated their liberation, Kira Tell reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. 4 years earlier, her people had been hunted refugees with nowhere to turn. Now they were partners in a galactic alliance that was reshaping civilization itself. The transformation hadn't come through superior technology or military might, though those had played their part. It had come through a simple recognition that beings could choose cooperation over domination, diversity over uniformity, freedom over security. Humanity had shown the galaxy that kindness wasn't weakness, that helping others ultimately helped yourself, that the strongest civilizations were built on willing participation rather than forced compliance. It was a lesson that had taken root across hundreds of worlds, and was growing into something that would define the next chapter of galactic history. The old order was dead, though its remnants still clung to power in isolated systems. The new order was still being born, shaped by the ongoing choices of trillions of beings who were learning what it meant to be truly free. But most importantly, the galaxy had learned that when people were rejected by those in power, there would always be others ready to open their arms in welcome. That lesson would echo through the stars for generations to come, ensuring that no being would ever again have to face persecution alone. Rejected by the galaxy, but humanity opened its arms. 10 years had passed since the end of the Hegemony War, and Captain Kiratel stood once again in the observation lounge of a starship. But this time, everything was different. The vessel beneath her feet was the Times Galactic Harmony *, flagship of the newly established cooperative fleet, a joint defense force representing over 800 species across the galaxy. Through the transparent walls, she watched the impossible sight of the first galactic assembly in session. The massive orbital station had been built at the galactic center, in neutral space that belonged to no single species or alliance. Representatives from nearly every known civilization had gathered to participate in the galaxy's first truly democratic government. Hard to believe, isn't it, Doctor? Nemcall joined her at the viewing port, his aged features bearing the contentment of someone who had lived to see their deepest hopes fulfilled. When we fled Zephyr, I never imagined we'd live to see something like this. The assembly station was itself a marvel of cooperative engineering. Aquatic Confederacy bio-architects had grown living sections that filtered atmosphere and provided sustainable ecosystems. Builder Crystal Tech formed the structural framework, stronger than any metal and capable of expanding as needed. Empathic collective neural networks facilitated communication between species with completely different languages and thought patterns. Human coordination protocols ensured that all these elements worked together seamlessly. But the true marvel wasn't the technology, it was watching former enemies work together as equals. Kiratel observed a debate in progress between a delegation of reformed hegemony species and representatives from worlds they had once oppressed. Instead of recrimination and revenge, she witnessed genuine attempts at understanding and reconciliation. Ambassador Santos to Captain Kiratel. Her communicator chimed. Even now, 15 years later, it amused her to hear Maria Santos referred to by formal titles. The young woman who had once asked simple questions that cut through diplomatic complexity now served as Earth's primary representative to the Galactic Assembly. Go ahead, Ambassador, Kiratel responded. We need you in Conference Room 7. We're addressing the Remnant situation, and your expertise would be valuable. The Remnant referred to the handful of former hegemony hardliners who still refused to accept the new galactic order. Led by the aging Supreme Admiral Carthul, they controlled a few dozen systems in the galaxy's outer rim, maintaining their authoritarian rule through fear and propaganda. They weren't powerful enough to threaten the broader galaxy, but they remained a source of suffering for billions of beings trapped under their control. Conference Room 7 buzzed with quiet conversation as representatives from 50 species discussed the ongoing crisis. Admiral Chen, now in her 70s but still sharp as ever, was explaining the latest intelligence reports. The remnant has been recruiting from isolated systems, promising protection from galactic chaos, she reported. They're also harboring refugees from liberated worlds, beings who genuinely fear the changes happening around them and prefer the certainty of oppression to the uncertainty of freedom. Ambassador Santos nodded thoughtfully. Which brings us to the fundamental question. Do we have the right to force freedom on people who don't want it? The question hung in the air like a challenge to everything they had fought for. It was the kind of moral complexity that had no easy answers. The sort of issue that the old hegemony would have resolved through force or administrative decree. Councillor Tefmal of the Altarian Federation, now one of the most vocal advocates for democratic cooperation, spoke first. During our time under hegemony rule, we told ourselves we were maintaining order and stability. We convinced ourselves that beings needed strong guidance to prevent chaos. It took witnessing the final protocol to realize we were simply afraid of losing control. But some beings genuinely seem to prefer hierarchical structures, observed Karis 9. The question is whether that preference stems from genuine inclination or generations of conditioning. Kiratel found herself thinking about her own people's journey. The Zephyrians had initially struggled with Earth's informal social structures, more comfortable with clear chains of command than collaborative decision-making. It had taken months of careful adjustment to appreciate the freedom to choose their own roles and relationships. Perhaps, she suggested, the answer isn't whether to intervene, but how to provide alternatives without forcing them. The discussion continued for hours, exploring options that ranged from diplomatic isolation to humanitarian intervention. But gradually, a consensus emerged around a characteristically human approach: patient engagement, combined with visible proof that alternatives existed. The Galactic Assembly ultimately approved the Open Door Protocol. Instead of military action against the remnant territories, the galaxy would maintain open communication channels, provide assistance to any beings who wished to leave, and most importantly, ensure that remnant populations had access to truthful information about conditions in the free galaxy. The protocol reflected hard-won lessons about the nature of freedom and social change. You couldn't force people to be free, but you could ensure they had the information and opportunity to make genuine choices about their lives. Implementation of the Open Door Protocol became Kiratel's responsibility, leading a joint mission that included representatives from every major alliance species. The work was slow and often frustrating, but gradually it began to show results. The first breakthrough came when a group of young remnant citizens, exposed to alliance communications, began asking questions their leaders couldn't answer. Why were free worlds prospering while remnant territories struggled with resource shortages? Why did refugees flee times to times the Alliance rather than seeking sanctuary in remnant space? Why did former hegemony species seem happier now than they had under authoritarian rule? These questions sparked underground movements within remnant territories. Secret communication networks allowed isolated populations to share information and coordinate resistance efforts. Most importantly, they began to see that the choice wasn't between order and chaos, but between different kinds of order, one imposed from above and one built through voluntary cooperation. The end came not with dramatic battles or political revolutions, but with what historians would later call the Great Migration. Over the course of 2 years, roughly 60% of the remnant population simply left for Alliance territory. They came not as refugees fleeing persecution, but as families and communities choosing to join a civilization that offered them more opportunities to determine their own futures. Supreme Admiral Carthul's final speech was broadcast across his remaining territories. You have chosen chaos over order, uncertainty over security. When your experiment in freedom collapses into barbarism, remember that we offered you a better path. But by then, his audience had shrunk to a handful of die-hard supporters and the automated systems that maintained his crumbling infrastructure. Even most of his military forces had joined the exodus, preferring the challenges of freedom to the safety of servitude. The remnant territories were eventually incorporated into the Galactic Assembly through a careful process of rehabilitation and integration. Former authoritarians were offered therapy and education rather than punishment, while their victims received support and opportunities to heal from generations of oppression. Standing in the Assembly's main hall 5 years later, Kiratel watched as representatives from the former remnant worlds participated in their first democratic vote. The issue under consideration was whether to establish new colonies in previously unexplored regions of the galaxy, a project that would require unprecedented cooperation between hundreds of species. The debate was vigorous but respectful, with representatives arguing passionately for their positions while maintaining civility toward their opponents. It was the kind of scene that would have been impossible under hegemony rule, where policy was dictated from above and dissent was suppressed. The final vote was overwhelmingly in favor of the colonization project, but with amendments that ensured environmental protection, indigenous rights, and voluntary participation. It was a decision that reflected the galaxy's hard-won wisdom about the balance between individual freedom and collective responsibility. As the session concluded, Kiratel found herself approached by a young remnant representative named Vel Karus. "Captain," he said, in accented Standard Galactic, "my grandmother often told stories about the old hegemony days. She said beings knew their place then, that there was security in having decisions made for you." "Ah," Kiratel nodded. "There is a certain comfort in certainty, even when that certainty comes at the cost of freedom. But watching today's debate, seeing so many different beings working together to solve problems, I think my grandmother was wrong. This is better than security. This is hope." Looking around the assembly hall, Kiratel had to agree. The galaxy had indeed chosen hope over security, uncertainty over control, the messy complexity of freedom over the false simplicity of oppression. It wasn't perfect, there were still conflicts, misunderstandings, and challenges that seemed almost insurmountable. But it was theirs to shape. All of theirs together, in ways that previous generations could never have imagined. The journey that began with 300 desperate refugees fleeing across space had culminated in a civilization where no being would ever again have to face persecution alone, where diversity was seen as strength rather than threat, where the default response to suffering was compassion rather than indifference. Earth and humanity had opened their arms to strangers in need, not knowing that this simple act of kindness would transform the entire galaxy. In return, they had received something beyond price proof, that the universe was vast enough for every kind of being, and that the strength to reshape civilization came not from conquest, but from the radical decision to help each other survive and thrive. The galaxy had rejected its outcasts and refugees, branded them as threats to order and stability. But in the end, those same outcasts had shown the galaxy what real strength looked like. Not the power to destroy, but the power to create. Not the ability to control others, but the wisdom to work together as equals. And in the end, that had made all the difference.